Picture a man who could tear apart a lion with his bare hands, who could kill 1,000 enemies with nothing but the jawbone of a donkey, who could carry away the gates of an entire city on his shoulders. Now picture that same man, blind and broken, grinding grain like an animal in his enemy's prison. This is the story of Samson, a man blessed with supernatural strength, but cursed by his own uncontrollable desires. A story that will break your heart even as it reveals the depths of divine grace. In the hill country of ancient Israel, when darkness covered the land and the people cried out under the cruel hand of their oppressors, God was preparing to do something extraordinary. For 40 years, the Philistines had ruled over Israel with an iron fist. Their warriors were fierce, their weapons superior, their cities fortified with walls that seemed to touch the heavens themselves. The children of Israel had forgotten their God, forgotten their calling, forgotten who they were meant to be. They lived in fear, cowering in caves and hidden places, their spirits crushed beneath the weight of foreign domination. But God had not forgotten them. In the small town of Zorah, there lived a man named Manoah from the tribe of Dan. His wife was barren, a condition that in those days carried not just personal sorrow, but social shame. They had prayed, they had hoped, they had waited, but the years passed and their arms remained empty. They had accepted their fate, resigned themselves to a childless existence. Then one day, as Manoah's wife sat alone in the field, the impossible happened. A figure appeared before her, not a man, though he looked like one. His presence filled the air with power. His face shone with otherworldly light. This was the angel of the Lord, the pre-incarnate Christ himself, come with a message that would change everything. "You are barren and have had no children," the angel said, his voice carrying the authority of heaven itself. "But you will conceive and bear a son." The woman's heart must have leaped within her, but the angel was not finished. "Now see to it that you drink no wine or other fermented drink, and that you do not eat anything unclean, because you will give birth to a son. No razor may be used on his head, because the boy is to be a Nazirite, dedicated to God from the womb. He will take the lead in delivering Israel from the hands of the Philistines. A Nazirite, one set apart, consecrated to God with vows that would mark him as holy. No wine would touch his lips, no razor would touch his hair, no dead body would defile him. And in return, God would fill him with strength beyond human imagination. This child would be the beginning of Israel's deliverance." When Manoah heard his wife's report, he did what any faithful man would do. He prayed, "Pardon your servant, Lord," he pleaded. "I beg you to let the man of God you sent to us come again to teach us how to bring up the boy who is to be born." God heard his prayer. The angel appeared again, this time to both husband and wife. Manoah, not recognizing the divine nature of his visitor, offered to prepare a meal. But the angel had other plans. "Though you detain me, I will not eat any of your food," the angel said. "But if you prepare a burnt offering, offer it to the Lord." When Manoah asked the angel's name, the response was mysterious. "Why do you ask my name? It is beyond understanding." Then, as the flame from the altar rose toward heaven, the angel ascended in the fire. Manoah and his wife fell face down, trembling, for they knew they had seen God. "We are doomed to die," Manoah cried out. "We have seen God." But his wife, filled with wisdom and faith, steadied his fears. If the Lord had meant to kill us, he would not have accepted a burnt offering and grain offering from our hands, nor shown us all these things, or now told us this. In due time, the promise was fulfilled. The woman bore a son, and they named him Samson, which means little son, for surely this child would bring light to Israel's darkness. As the boy grew, the Lord blessed him, and the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him in Mahane Dan, between Zorah and Eshtaol. But here is where our hearts begin to break. For this child, blessed beyond measure, set apart for God's purpose, would grow up to become a man driven not by divine calling, but by human appetite. The very strength that God gave him to deliver Israel would become the tool of his own destruction. As a young man, Samson went down to Timnah, a Philistine town, and there he saw a woman. She was beautiful, desirable, and forbidden, for the law of Moses strictly commanded the Israelites not to intermarry with the surrounding nations. But Samson's heart was not governed by God's law. "Get her for me as my wife," he demanded of his parents. "She's the right one for me." His father and mother were heartbroken. "Isn't there an acceptable woman among your relatives or among all our people?" they pleaded. "Must you go to the uncircumcised Philistines to get a wife?" They could not understand why their son, blessed by God, would choose to ally himself with Israel's enemies. But Samson was unmoved. His parents did not know that this was from the Lord, who was seeking an occasion to confront the Philistines. As Samson traveled to Timnah to see this woman, something extraordinary happened. A young lion came roaring toward him, its massive frame rippling with muscle, its jaws open wide, ready to tear him apart. But the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon Samson. With his bare hands, no weapon, no tool, nothing but the supernatural strength God had given him, he tore the lion apart as easily as one might tear apart a young goat. The power was intoxicating, overwhelming, magnificent. Yet even in this moment of divine intervention, we see the flaw in Samson's character. He told neither his father nor his mother what he had done. Already, the pattern was forming. A man who would use God's gifts for his own purposes while hiding his actions from those who loved him most. Sometime later, when he returned to marry the woman, Samson turned aside to look at the lion's carcass. There, in the hollow of the dead beast, bees had made their home and produced honey. Samson scooped out the honey with his hands and ate it as he walked, sharing it with his parents. But again, he did not tell them where it came from. For a Nazirite to touch a dead body was to break his vow, to defile himself before God. Yet Samson seemed to think nothing of it. The wedding feast lasted 7 days, as was the custom. 30 Philistine companions joined the celebration, and Samson, perhaps drunk on his own cleverness, proposed a riddle. Out of the eater, something to eat. Out of the strong, something sweet. The stakes were high, 30 linen garments and 30 sets of clothes. If they could solve it within 7 days, he would pay. If not, they would owe him. For 3 days, the companions struggled with the riddle. By the 4th day, their frustration turned to desperation, and desperation bred treachery. They went to Samson's bride with a threat that chills the blood. "Coax your husband into explaining the riddle for us, or we will burn you and your father's household to death." Terror filled the young woman's heart. She went to Samson with tears streaming down her face. "You hate me. You don't really love me," she sobbed. "You've given my people a riddle, but you haven't told me the answer." For 3 more days she wept and pleaded, pressing him relentlessly. Finally, on the 7th day, Samson's resolve crumbled. He told her the answer because she continued to press him. That very day, before sunset, the men came to Samson with their solution. "What is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion?" Samson's rage was volcanic. He knew immediately what had happened. "If you had not plowed with my heifer," he snarled, "you would not have solved my riddle." The Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him again, but this time in judgment rather than blessing. He went down to Ashkelon, struck down 30 of their men, stripped them of everything, and gave their clothes to those who had explained the riddle. His anger burned hot as he returned to his father's home, leaving his bride behind. In his absence, she was given to one of his companions. This should have been the end of the story. A lesson learned, a mistake acknowledged, a return to his divine calling. But Samson's heart was not changed. During wheat harvest, he returned to Timnah with a young goat, intending to visit his wife. "I'm going to my wife's room," he announced. But her father would not let him go in. "I was so sure you hated her," the father explained, "that I gave her to your companion. Isn't her younger sister more attractive? Take her instead." The betrayal cut deep. The rejection was complete. And Samson's response revealed the darkness that was growing in his heart. "This time I have a right to get even with the Philistines," he declared. "I will really harm them." He went out and caught 300 foxes. Can you imagine the effort, the planning, the sheer determination this required? He tied them tail to tail in pairs and fastened a torch to every pair of tails. Then he lit the torches and released the foxes into the standing grain of the Philistines. The fire spread through the grain fields, the vineyards, the olive groves. The economic devastation was total. When the Philistines learned that Samson had done this because his wife had been given to his companion, their response was swift and brutal. They burned her and her father to death, the very fate she had tried to avoid by betraying Samson's riddle. The irony was cruel, the waste of life heartbreaking. Samson's grief turned to vengeance. "Since you've acted like this," he vowed, "I swear that I won't stop until I get my revenge on you." He attacked them viciously and slaughtered many. Then he went down and stayed in a cave in the rock of Etam, hiding like an outlaw in his own promised land. But the Philistines were not finished. They came up into Judah, spread out, and made camp at Lehi. When the men of Judah asked why they had come to fight against them, the Philistines replied, "We have come to take Samson prisoner, to do to him as he did to us." 3,000 men from Judah went down to the rock of Edom to confront their own kinsmen. "Don't you realize that the Philistines are rulers over us?" they demanded. "What have you done to us?" Their words reveal the depth of Israel's spiritual poverty. They had become so accustomed to slavery that they were angry at the one man fighting for their freedom. Samson's response was weary. "I merely did to them what they did to me." But he agreed to be bound and handed over, making them promise not to kill him themselves. They bound him with 2 new ropes and led him up from the rock. As he approached Lehi, the Philistines came toward him, shouting in triumph. Then the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him. The ropes on his arms became like charred flax, and the bindings dropped from his hands. Finding the fresh jawbone of a donkey, he grabbed it and struck down 1,000 men. In that moment of supernatural victory, Samson composed a song. "With a donkey's jawbone, I have made donkeys of them. With a donkey's jawbone, I have killed 1,000 men." The victory was complete, but it left Samson exhausted and desperately thirsty. He cried out to the Lord, "You have given your servant this great victory. Must I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised?" God, in his mercy, opened up the hollow place in Lehi, and water came out of it. When Samson drank, his strength returned and he revived. For 20 years, Samson led Israel as judge. But leadership did not bring maturity. Power did not produce character. If anything, the isolation of his unique calling seemed to drive him further into loneliness and moral compromise. One day, Samson went to Gaza, a major Philistine city, and there he saw a prostitute. He went in to spend the night with her, abandoning his Nazirite vows, defiling himself with immorality, consorting with his enemies. When the people of Gaza learned that Samson was there, they surrounded the place and lay in wait for him all night at the city gate. "At dawn we'll kill him," they whispered to each other. But Samson did not stay until dawn. At midnight he rose, took hold of the doors of the city gate, together with the 2 posts, and tore them loose, bar and all. He lifted them to his shoulders and carried them to the top of the hill that faces Hebron, a distance of nearly 40 miles. The gates of Gaza, massive structures designed to keep armies at bay, carried away like kindling by one man's supernatural strength. It was a demonstration of power that should have brought him to his knees in worship. Instead, it seemed only to fuel his pride and his appetite for forbidden pleasures. Sometime later, Samson fell in love with a woman in the valley of Sorek named Delilah. Her name means delicate or dainty, but there was nothing delicate about her intentions. The rulers of the Philistines came to her with an offer that revealed their desperation. See if you can lure him into showing you the secret of his great strength and how we can overpower him so we may tie him up and subdue him. Each one of us will give you 1,100 shekels of silver, 1,100 shekels from each ruler. The total sum would have made Delilah one of the wealthiest women in the land. The price on Samson's head was enormous, reflecting both their fear of him and their determination to destroy him. And Delilah, whose heart was not softened by love, but hardened by greed, accepted their offer. What follows is perhaps the most tragic seduction in all of Scripture, not because of its physical nature, but because it reveals the complete spiritual blindness of a man who had been called to be Israel's deliverer. Tell me the secret of your great strength, Delilah pleaded, and how you can be tied up and subdued. 3 times Samson lied to her, and 3 times she tested his words. First, he told her that 7 fresh bowstrings would bind him. She tied him up and cried, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." But he snapped the bowstrings as easily as a thread snaps when it comes close to a flame. The second time, he said new ropes that had never been used would hold him. Again, she bound him, and again she cried out the warning. He broke the ropes off his arms like thread. The third deception was more elaborate. If you weave the 7 braids of my head into the fabric on the loom and tighten it with the pin, I'll become as weak as any other man. While he slept, she did exactly as he had said. But when she called out, he awoke and pulled up the pin and the loom, together with the fabric. Any reasonable man would have seen the pattern. Any wise man would have recognized the trap. But Samson was blinded by his own desires, intoxicated by a woman who was systematically betraying him. When Delilah complained, "How can you say, 'I love you,' when you won't confide in me? This is the 3rd time you have made a fool of me and haven't told me the secret of your great strength." He should have walked away. He should have run. Instead, day after day, she prodded him and nagged him until he was sick to death of it. Finally, the unthinkable happened. This man, set apart from birth as a Nazirite, dedicated to God with sacred vows, told her everything. "No razor has ever been used on my head," he confessed, "because I have been a Nazirite dedicated to God from my mother's womb. If my head were shaved, my strength would leave me, and I would become as weak as any other man." Delilah knew she had finally heard the truth. She sent word to the rulers of the Philistines, "Come back once more. He has told me everything." They returned, bringing the silver with them. That night, as Samson slept with his head in her lap, Delilah called in a man to shave off the 7 braids of his hair. Then, for the 4th time, she cried out, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." He awoke from his sleep and thought, "I'll go out as before and shake myself free." But he did not know that the Lord had left him. The words pierced like a sword. He did not know that the Lord had left him. For all his strength, for all his victories, for all his supernatural power, Samson had been living in spiritual blindness, so complete that he could not sense the departure of God's presence. The Philistines seized him immediately. They gouged out his eyes, those eyes that had looked upon forbidden things, that had led him into temptation, that had gazed with lust instead of faith. They bound him with bronze shackles and took him down to Gaza. There, the man who had once carried away their city gates was put to grinding grain in the prison, turning the millstone like an ox or a donkey. But even in judgment, God's mercy was at work. The hair on Samson's head began to grow again, and with it, perhaps, came the beginning of repentance. The rulers of the Philistines assembled to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon, their god, and to celebrate. "Our God has delivered Samson, our enemy, into our hands," they rejoiced. Their temple was packed, about 3,000 men and women on the roof alone, all watching the spectacle of their fallen enemy. When their hearts were high with wine and celebration, They called for Samson to entertain them. Picture the scene. The great judge of Israel, blind and broken, being led by a servant, performing like a trained animal for the amusement of his enemies. "Bring out Samson to entertain us," they shouted. As Samson stood among the pillars, he spoke to the servant who held his hand. "Put me where I can feel the pillars that support the temple, so that I may lean against them." And there, in his darkest hour, surrounded by the mockery of his enemies, Samson did something he had not done in years. He prayed. "Sovereign Lord," he cried out, his voice breaking with anguish and determination, "remember me. Please, God, strengthen me just once more, and let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." It was not a perfect prayer. It was still focused on revenge rather than pure devotion to God's glory. But it was sincere, it was desperate, and it was heard. Samson reached toward the 2 central pillars on which the temple stood. Bracing himself against them, his right hand on one and his left hand on the other, he called out, "Let me die with the Philistines." Then he pushed with all his might. The temple came down on the rulers and all the people in it. In his death, Samson killed many more than he had killed during his life. The man who had lived for himself finally gave his life for his people. His brothers and his father's whole family came down to get him. They brought him back and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the tomb of Manoah his father. The circle was complete, from birth to death, from promise to fulfillment, from blessing to tragedy to final redemption. What are we to make of this story? How do we understand a man blessed with such extraordinary gifts who threw them away so carelessly? How do we reconcile the supernatural power with the moral failure, the divine calling with the human weakness? Samson's story is ultimately about the tragedy of wasted potential. Here was a man who could have been the greatest deliverer in Israel's history. He had strength beyond imagination, victory over impossible odds, supernatural power at his disposal. But strength without character is dangerous. Power without principle is destructive. Gifting without godliness leads to ruin. From his birth, Samson was set apart. The Nazirite vow marked him as holy, different, consecrated to God. But instead of embracing his calling, he chafed against it. Instead of seeing his restrictions as protection, he viewed them as limitations to be overcome. The very things that marked him as God's chosen became the things he was most eager to violate. He was driven by appetite rather than principle. His eyes led him into temptation. The woman at Timnah, the prostitute at Gaza, the treacherous Delilah. His desires overruled his dedication. His passions overcame his purpose. Time and again, he placed his immediate gratification above his eternal calling. Yet even in Samson's failure, we see God's grace. The strength he abused was still God's gift. The victories he won, even for selfish reasons, still served God's purposes. The deliverance he began, even though incomplete, still blessed Israel. God worked through Samson's weakness, using even his flawed character to accomplish divine purposes. And in the end, in his moment of final surrender, we glimpse the man Samson could have been all along. Blind, broken, humbled, he finally prayed with genuine dependence on God. His last act was not one of selfish revenge, but of sacrificial service. He gave his life to destroy Israel's enemies, finally fulfilling the purpose for which he had been born. Samson's story is a warning to all who would serve God. Talent is not enough. Gifting is not sufficient. Power without character is a recipe for disaster. The man who could tear apart lions and carry away city gates could not control his own desires. The judge who delivered Israel from their enemies could not deliver himself from temptation. But it is also a story of hope. Even our failures cannot ultimately frustrate God's purposes. Even our weakness cannot completely nullify His strength. Even our sin cannot entirely silence His grace. In His mercy, God can use even broken vessels, even flawed servants, even tragic heroes to accomplish his will. The real tragedy of Samson's life was not his death. It was how he lived, blessed with extraordinary gifts, called to extraordinary purpose. He settled for an ordinary life driven by ordinary desires. He had everything he needed to be great, but he chose to be merely strong. In our own lives, we face the same choice. We may not have Samson's supernatural strength, but we have our own gifts, our own callings, our own divine purposes. The question is whether we will use them for God's glory or our own gratification. Will we be driven by appetite or by obedience? Will we seek immediate pleasure or eternal purpose? Samson's story reminds us that strength without self-control is weakness, that power without principle is poverty, that gifting without godliness is ultimately meaningless. But it also reminds us that God's grace is greater than our failures, that His purposes will ultimately prevail, and that even in our darkest moments, we can still cry out to Him for strength. The man who had strength, but no self-control, teaches us that true strength comes not from physical power, but from spiritual discipline. True victory comes not from conquering enemies, but from conquering ourselves. True greatness comes not from what we can do, but from who we choose to be. May we learn from both his triumphs and his failures. May we embrace our callings with humility rather than pride. May we use our gifts for God's glory rather than our own gratification. And may we never forget that the God who strengthened Samson, even in his weakness, is the same God who offers to strengthen us today.